All right. I'm just going to wait until noon. So we start right at noon. Hello and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Midra Surratt with Parent Information Center of Delaware, and joining us today is Maria Lacuniak, Education Associate with the Exceptional Children's Resources Work Group at the Delaware Department of Education. Throughout the year, the Delaware Department of Education hosts a number of meetings for families, caregivers, community members, and professionals and advocates to provide feedback on the state performance measures as mandated under IDEA. Parents, community members, and other stakeholders are essential in improving systems and outcomes for children in Delaware. The Delaware Department of Education is hosting a number of upcoming sessions, including the one that you're participating in today, providing an overview of each of the indicators with opportunities for you to make recommendations to the state as it relates to their policies, procedures, and practices. Today, we will review and discuss indicators 11, 15, and 16, which focus on 3 areas relating to school-age children around conducting timely initial evaluations of students to determine eligibility for special education services, increasing the use of resolution sessions to resolve due process hearing complaints, and increasing the use of mediation services to resolve differences between families and schools. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback at the end of this session. I'll now turn the presentation over to Maria. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this today, Midra. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending today. And if you have questions as we go along or comments, please feel free, to stop me, and I'd be happy to assist and answer your questions. So here's our agenda for our time together. First, I'll tell you a little bit about indicator 11, its definition. We'll review some data. And then I'll have some questions for you about baseline and strategies for improvement. Similarly, then we'll go into indicator 15, which is resolution sessions. Again, I'll give you some background, definitions, and data to review. And then we'll talk about baseline, target setting, and strategies for improvement. And then finally, we'll move into indicator 16, which is mediation. Again, I'll provide you some background, data review, and we'll get into the questions with baseline and target setting. Okay, so indicator 11 is also known as child find. And it's basically the percent of children who were evaluated within 45 school days or 90 calendar days, whichever is less, of receiving parental consent for the initial evaluation. So the reason why it says 45 school days or 90 calendar days, whichever is less, is that sometimes you can think of winter break. If a parent requests an evaluation in December 12th, most likely the 90 calendar days will become before the 45 school days. So the goal is to get your child evaluated in a timely manner. So here what I'm showing you is some data that we've collected over the years from 2013 all the way to 2019. So you'll see in the first row, the number of children for whom parental consent to evaluate was received. And the second row is the number of children whose evaluations were completed within that 45 school day or 90 calendar day time frame. And then the first white row is the percentage. So it's taken into account those 2 figures. So for example, you can see in 2019, 2,622 parental consents were received. Of those, 2,582 children were evaluated in a timely manner. So that is 98.5% of evaluations were completed on time. And our target is always 100%. So here with the two figures, you can see, again, it's just the data presented in a different way. For 2019, 40 students were not evaluated on time. Okay, so in talking about the annual performance report, this is data that we submit to the federal government each year. And we have to get stakeholder input on a number of things. So we have our baseline currently set in 2006. And at that time, evaluations, 91% of the evaluations were completed in a timely manner. 2006 was a pretty long time ago. So I wanted to ask you as stakeholders, should we change the baseline to make it something more recent? So here's the data to look at, and here's the years. And then again, our goal is always 100, but this row right here is, what we've actually achieved. So does anyone have any suggestions as to what the baseline should be? And I also want to let you know that, if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, that's okay. I have a survey that Midra will provide access to with these same questions that you can certainly answer, on your own. Your input is really important and helpful.
I don't see anything in the chat right now at the moment, Maria, but I will upload with the chat with the links to the survey.
Great, thank you. And if anybody wants to chime in, even if I'm on another question, please feel free to do so. Okay, what are some of the processes and procedures in place that help teams conduct timely evaluations? So thinking about it from your perspective as parents, if you've had your child participate in an initial evaluation, is there anything you can think of that your district or charter school had in place that was good, that helped them complete the evaluation in a timely manner and hold that eligibility meeting? Anything you thought that was helpful?
Yeah, I still don't see anything, so we can continue.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
What are some obstacles that impede timely evaluations? Have you had any experiences or can think of anything that would impede the school staff from completing the evaluations in a timely manner?
So Maria, as a parent center, one of the things that we have seen at times might have been getting consent from a parent, or if there were questions around the types of evaluations, sometimes that could impede the moving forward with a timely evaluation. But I would also imagine right now, just given the circumstances with COVID and with quarantines and students being in and out, that could be some potential obstacles that could impede timely evaluations as well. And I'll check the chat. I don't see that there are any other comments at the moment, but we'll continue to monitor that.
Okay, thank you. That's very good insight. Very helpful. Thank you. And the last question for this indicator, can you identify some strategies for improvement? What could help the process, help us get to that 100%? Is there something that parents can do or schools can do to make things more efficient and more timely?
I think it might be helpful to have a understanding of some of the reasons that were, what some of the obstacles were. So for example, for those, I think it was 40 children, that for various reasons that the evaluations were not completed in a timely manner. It might be helpful to have some context around, if we know what the reasons were for that, and then that might help provide some strategies around ways to improve that.
Yeah, I don't have the data right in front of me. I could certainly go back and look at that data, but from what I recall about those 40 students, some factors were, there's a shortage of school psychologists. So finding school psychologists to contract with was one issue. Another one in particular was contracting with bilingual school psychologists. They were even harder to find. And much like you said, COVID and quarantines, both staff and students, being in and out, from what I can recall. Okay, so again, I encourage you to think about this data and the questions, and you can certainly provide your feedback in the survey. Okay, so now we'll move on to resolution sessions. And this is defined as the percent of hearing requests. So here we're talking about due process hearings. So the percent of hearing requests that went to resolution sessions that were resolved through resolution session settlement agreements. So a resolution session is basically when a parent files a due process request. The district or charter school has to offer another meeting called a resolution session within 15 days to try to talk about and work out the problem so that it doesn't necessarily escalate through, to the hearing. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. So that resolution session settlement agreement is, if it does get resolved, that is put in writing and it's an agreement. So resolving the concern. So here you see a lot of data from 2013-14 all the way to last school year, 2020-21. And you'll see in the top row the number of due process complaints filed. And then the two highlighted areas are really the main focus of this indicator. So you'll see the number of resolution meetings, followed by the number of written settlement agreements reached through these meetings. So as you can see, there are not many resolution meetings, especially compared to the number of complaints filed. And then the number of agreements that come out of that are even less. Again, and this is the same data. You'll see the resolution meetings and then the settlement agreements, and then the data that we report, which really converts these two numbers into a percentage. So you'll see down here that the federal government has a rule that we don't have to set baseline and targets except in years when the number of resolution meetings is 10 or greater. So that's why the circle is here. So our baseline is in 2015 because that was the only year that we had 10. This year we had 6. And this is just the data presented in another way. So you'll see the resolution meetings in blue. And then on top of it, the yellow is the number of agreements compared to the number of meetings. Okay, so given the rules around the baselines, do you agree with keeping the baseline as it is? So again, the rule is you can only establish the baseline in years that are 10 or more.
So Maria, just to clarify, in years where it's 10 or more, the baseline would be 50%. Is that or what are we looking at? I just want to make sure that the participants are clear with they're providing feedback on.
So if it was 10 or more, that would be the year the baseline would occur. So in this case, yes, it happens to be 50% because we had 5 agreements. But if this was, 12 and 7, that percentage would be different. But in this case, yes, it would be 50% in the baseline at 2015. So we really don't have a choice, I guess. Okay. What we do have a choice about is we can make those targets a range or select a single number. So for example, you'll see here, the target was 50%. But starting in 2017, because we had a stakeholder meeting, the stakeholders decided they wanted a range. So that these numbers, when you divide them, should fall between 50 to 60%. So the first question is, do you feel that it's better to have a range or to have a single number? And remember, this is a state target. So for the whole state, all the resolution meetings and settlement agreements.
I don't see anything in the chat regarding this question. I will also add the link to the survey for participants to respond to their questions and provide feedback that way. We did, however, going back to the previous indicator 11, there was a comment that I see in the chat, and it was actually from one of our staff that says, as a parent consultant, what they've seen as a potential barrier to timely evaluations was what you also mentioned, the lack of staff at the school available to do the evaluation. So I think you had mentioned that around the school psychologists and other staff that are necessary to complete the evaluation.
Okay, great.
And then regarding your question here, with regard to the range, we have a comment that is in favor of the range. They think that that's a good practice to be implemented here.
Great, thank you. And another question, another option is, if we did go with a range, we could certainly keep it stable, over the year. So we have to look at from 2020 to 2025 and set targets. So we could keep it, 50 to 60 from 2020 to 2025, or we could do increasing targets. We could do, 50 to 55, 2020, and then 2021 do 55 to 60, and so forth. So does anyone have, a preference or a suggestion as far as keeping the range stable or increasing it?
I'm stable. There's one comment that says stable, keeping it stable. I did have a quick question for you, Maria. As part of this process, I know that, and one of the things that we wanted to emphasize in these sessions is that there is, what the department has to report to OSEP as a part of the APR, but ultimately, the goal is to improve outcomes for children with disabilities and provide support to their families. And so as part of this process, and maybe you'll talk about this a little later on this is part of the actual stakeholder meetings, where we talk about some of the reasons why, there might be less resolution meetings or parents are not accessing resolution meetings, and we can kind of flesh out some systemic issues that could be occurring or other barriers that could be experienced. And I just wanted to make that a point in this presentation, because there's the report, that the data that has to be reported, but ultimately all of this work is about improving outcomes for children and supporting families in this process. So this is one of the many reasons why your feedback is really important and critical, because it helps the department and kind of understanding what are those gaps and what's happening on the ground with families. So that was a question and a very long tangent. I apologize,
No.
but I just wanted to comment on that. There's also another question in the chat. What would be the benefit to having an increase each year?
That's a good question. And I think this data, it's hard to, make a determination in the sense that if we had 10 or more, each year, and we could kind of see the percentages if they went up or down, right? We could make an inference and a best judgment about, the data and the targets. But since we only have 1 year, and that was in 2015, it's kind of hard to make that determination, in my estimation, because you have one data point. So it's kind of like we have to set targets just in case we do hit that number. But Midra, I'm so thankful you brought up that point. I think it's a good point. We only have a half hour today. So I was kind of seeing today as, setting the stage and looking at the data, but absolutely moving forward, I do want to have more meetings like this where we dig into the data and ask those important questions. Why aren't resolution meetings happening? One hypothesis could be that by the time you get to filing a due process, you're so upset that just another meeting to rehash out what you think you've already talked about doesn't seem productive. That could be one thing. We're talking about due process, so there may or may not be lawyers involved. So they may, guide you in one direction, saying, no, we're not going to have a meeting, or, let me talk for you. It could be a number of factors. So I'd like to get that input at some point and talk about ways to resolve conflict. Mm-hmm. And the last question, can you identify some strategies for improvement? Some ways to convene more resolution sessions and having them result in agreements.
Yeah, I think what'll be key here for me would be to get feedback on why the benefits of the resolution sessions, if we're able to track that, what the family's experience was in the resolution session, if they felt that it was beneficial, and that will give us some additional input on ways that we can identify strategies for improvement. That's my feedback. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, but again, the link has been posted. So by all means, you can utilize that link to provide your feedback as well.
Thank you. Okay, and last but not least, we'll move into mediation. And it's similar to resolution sessions. So it's the percent of mediations held that resulted in mediation agreements. So here's a whole bunch of numbers again. From 2013-14 to 2020-2021. So you'll see the number of mediations held, the number of mediation agreements related to due process complaints, and then the number of mediation agreements not related to due process complaints. So we're seeing some, from due process. And some, these could be from state complaints, or, you could go to mediation just by itself. So that's what those numbers represent. Okay, and this yellow here is the same data presented again, but you'll see the targets and the data, again, they're just represented as percentages. And our baseline was in 2005 at 64%. So again, that same rule applies. You have to have 10 or more for your baseline and to set targets. And that was way back in 2005. And similarly, here's the data presented in a bar graph. So light blue is mediation agreements related to due process complaints. This kind of purple color is mediation agreements not related to due process complaints. And then yellow is total mediations held. So over the years, you can see how that sort of evolved. So then the first question is about the baseline. So again, looking at that 10 number, if we want to make it more recent, we have 11 here at 2014 and 13 at 2015. But notice the data is different. So we have 90% of the mediations resulted in agreements. And here we have only 76%. And, you know, again, it looks like, and it is a big jump in numbers, but we're dealing with such a small amount that even one number, you know, makes a big difference. So take that into account. So, I mean, one could make the argument, set the baseline here because it's higher, it's 90, or set it here because it's lower. So it's kind of like your perspective, what you think is most beneficial. So does anyone have any thoughts or comments about that?
Maria, is a range an option here? I see a range for subsequent years.
Yes, yes, it is. It's the same thing. It could be a range and it can be stable or it can be increasing.
It seems to fluctuate quite a bit, but even in that fluctuation, it still stands between 70 to 80%. That seems to be consistent, at least the last several years. I'm sure 2020 and 2021 will be very different, just in terms of the data, just because of what we're experiencing right now. I would need to look at it a little more, but I'm leaning more in favor of a range.
Okay.
Just based on what I'm seeing here. And I don't, again, here, I don't see anything in the comments for that particular, with responses to that specific question.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And can you identify some strategies for improvement? So ways, you know, to conduct more mediations and having them result in mediation agreements. You know, and this is again what you were talking about earlier, Vidra, about finding out information and continuous improvement. You know, do you think the word is out that parents know that mediation is even an option? Is that something to improve upon?
So speaking as a PTI, and I do know we have some staff on, so staff feel free to weigh in as well. We, I mean, we could always increase you know, from our perspective, sharing information around conflict, you know, ways of resolving conflict with families, utilizing mediation as a tool. We can always increase that. One of the areas that, or some of the feedback that we have received in the past from families is that they didn't necessarily find mediation to be useful in resolving their conflict. And so that might be a potential deterrent or something that would need to be explored further to find out what are the reasons that they felt it was unsuccessful. And maybe that's even something, you know, as a stakeholder group, the stakeholder group can develop some maybe follow-up questions or a process. I don't know, I mean, that's just some kind of brainstorming here, but to get that feedback from families to find out, well, why isn't it this, why hasn't this been useful for you? And I don't see anything else in the chat. but that's the one thing that comes to mind for me. Oh, here's a comment in the chat. It says, I've received feedback that mediation has not resulted in actual resolutions.
Okay.
So in that instance, was there an agreement, but it was unresolved, or they just, I just wanted to clarify. Yes, so there was an agreement, but it was not resolved. I see yes, so I guess that's answering my question.
Oh. Yeah, that sounds,
Oh, yes, so okay, so there was an agreement, but not resolved and ended in the state complaint. So it sounds like that would be something that we could get more information from, because perhaps there were several, as you mentioned earlier, Maria, there might have been several issues.
right.
So there was an agreement in one area, but the other areas were not resolved. And so they proceeded and they moved forward with the state complaint. But I think that data is also helpful because it might lend to why parents are, feel that that may or may not be a viable option for them.
Right. Yeah, it's all important information. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so that was the information I had today, the questions. And I thank you so much for taking your lunch break to be here with me today and to listen. And again, I encourage you to please take a look at the survey and answer any and all of the questions you can. There's no right or wrong answer. We really value your input and want to make this the best as possible. So thank you for your time today. And thank you, Mildred.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maria. And just as a reminder, the survey links will be posted on Facebook as well to access. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.